An important subject in using the JavaScript API is asynchronous programming. If you're going to be going beyond any of the basic functionality of the API, you're probably going to run into a scenario where you're going to have to use asynchronous programming. That'll be a lot more clear if we show an example of that, so let's just go ahead and get started. To follow along, you can use your JavaScript and HTML files from the previous video on categorical filtering and selecting marks, or you can download the zip from this web page, extract it, and you'll see the following files. Let's rename our lesson 4 start to tutorial. Make sure you rename the JavaScript file once again, and let's edit that in Notepad++. I'm going to create a new function, and I'm going to call it problem example, because I'm going to show an example of where if you don't use asynchronous programming, you run into a problem. And the idea here is that I want to switch sheets and immediately filter. So let's combine the logic we have from switching sheets with the logic for filtering and see what happens. To switch sheets, we need to first get our workbook. And then with that workbook object, we activate a new sheet. Activate sheet async. And in this case, we'll switch to our line chart. Now we want to filter on that line chart. So we'll grab the active sheet. Sheet equals workbook.getActiveSheet. And to that sheet, we'll apply a filter, just as we've done in the categorical filtering video. I'm going to do it to category here. And for this example, I'll just filter to just the stuffed animals. Let's do a replace type of filter and close the bracket for that function. Now we need to save that and go into our HTML to expose a button to call that problem example function. And just to keep things nicely organized, I'm going to grab this nav header for filtering and selecting marks, paste it in, and rename it asynchronous programming. Then I'm going to grab one of the buttons that I've created earlier. Any button will do, but I'll just grab show only books, and I'll title it problem example. Instead of calling the show only function, I want to call the function that we just created called problem example. There's no arguments to that function, so just open parentheses, close parentheses, and let's go ahead and save that file and run it in Chrome. So now we have that new button, and if we click that button, it does successfully switch sheets, but it does not successfully filter to stuffed animals. Now why is that? The reason is because when we switch sheets, you see that little spinner, and that's because we're sending a request to Tableau server to switch sheets. It begins to switch sheets for us, and when it's done, now we are ready to call the filter. But if we just put those two lines next to each other, or those 4 lines in this case, on top of each other, by the time we get to apply filter async, the viz is not ready yet. That is, it's not active yet. We're starting to switch sheets and we're not yet active. Let's go back to our JavaScript file to explore exactly why this is not working. The problem is that this activate sheet async, it takes about a half a second in this case. And before it's done, we're trying to apply a filter to it. So that apply filter async is happening too early, before the workbook and the sheet are ready to have a filter applied to them. What we want is some way to tell the server, switch sheets to that line chart, wait until it's done switching, and then once it's done switching, apply the filter. So we'll come back to this example and see how asynchronous programming can solve that problem later. But to start with, I want to show an example of asynchronous programming that's probably the easiest function to create. And that's because it happens right inside of our embedding options object. So I'm going to add a comma to the end of hide tabs. And one option you can put inside of this options object is something called onFirstInteractive. Syntax is similar, use a colon there, but instead of a string or a Boolean there, it actually takes a function. So we'll say onFirstInteractive. To start with, I'm going to do alert viz is interactive and just close that function. And let's go to our browser here and see what that actually changes. So I'm going to go ahead and hit refresh. Now notice that pop-up occurs, that alert viz is interactive, but what actually happened was it didn't give us that pop-up until the visualization was done loading. So I'll go ahead and show that again. Hopefully you saw it that time, that the viz loaded and then we got the pop-up. Now it's probably not extremely useful to alert us when the viz is interactive, but this onFirstInteractive is actually quite useful for a lot of different JavaScript API scenarios. One of those might be, let's say you don't want to expose the buttons for your end user to press until the viz is ready to be interacted with. That's a useful case because you don't want them pressing buttons that aren't going to do anything if the viz isn't there. Another thing you might do is you might want to grab that workbook variable and store it so that we don't have to throughout our script say workbook equals viz.getWorkbook. So we'll just go ahead and grab that workbook, and now it's a variable that we can use throughout our script. I'm going to comment out that workbook equals viz.getWorkbook from the switch views because it's no longer necessary. One thing I noticed here is that I capitalized the B in workbook in the switch view. I'm going to go ahead and make it lowercase, and you probably want to do the same if you're following along with the exact same capitalization. So I'm going to save that. Go ahead and run this in Chrome. So we don't get that alert, but if we do switch our views, despite the fact that we don't have that workbook equals viz.getWorkbook, it still works because we put that inside of our onFirstInteractive. So now we understand the idea of asynchronous programming. It's that ability to tell the visualization, do something once you do something else. That is, do something once you're ready to. So onFirstInteractive is one example. And that problem example from earlier is another example of when we might need to use asynchronous programming. So let's go ahead and fix that problem example. I'm going to call it function solution. We might go ahead and say workbook equals viz.getWorkbook. But actually we don't need that because we did it before. What we do want to do is we want to switch sheets. Workbook.activate sheet async. Switch to the line chart just as we did before. And we're going to use a function, the key function to asynchronous programming, which is .then. So activate sheet async. We can actually string together with that function a .then function. And dot then, the argument to dot then is actually a function in and of itself. So we'll just give it, we'll say function just as we did earlier in on first interactive. And then we'll say what to do after activate sheet async. So let's pause for a second and explain what dot then does. Dot then is a promise to do whatever is inside of the dot then function after this activate sheet async, or whatever function is before the dot then, to do that after that is completed. So inside of that function, we'll say sheet equals workbook.getActiveSheet, same way as we did before to grab the sheet before filtering it. And we'll go ahead and apply the filter. Do the same filter as we did before, the stuffed animal on category. And we'll make sure it's a replace filter. So when we're chaining together a bunch of functions, the syntax of the parentheses and all that can get a little complicated. So just make sure you close the bracket, which you can see closes this function. Then we need to close the parentheses, which closes the dot then, and then we do a semicolon. And we'll go ahead and save that. We need to go ahead and go back to our HTML file and expose a button to call that new function. Follow a similar paradigm for naming here. And we'll make sure to call the solution function. Run that in Chrome. And if we hit solution, you'll notice it switches, and then a split second later it filters to our stuffed animals, just as we had planned. And so our dot then is working exactly how we want. Well, what if you want to go a step further? You don't want to just do two things, you want to do more than that. Dot then allows that as well. Notice how after activate sheet async we close the parentheses and then call dot then. After we close the parentheses for dot then, we can call another dot then. So I'm going to create a new function here. Maybe I'll also do a filter there. And this time I'll do an add filter, and I'll also add the gift certificates. So we need to first close the bracket here for the function, then we need to close our parentheses for dot then, and then we need a semicolon, just as before. We'll hit save, we'll go back to our browser here and hit refresh, and then we'll click on solution. It switched sheets, and then one at a time it showed us stuffed animals and also added gift certificates to that. And there's one more thing that dot then can do. It can actually have a contingency in case any exception is thrown inside of the chain before it. So let me just in the comment show exactly what the two arguments you put in dot then. And the first one is a function that happens on success, and the second one, which is optional, is a function that happens on error. So that first function we put on, we've been putting in there for the first two examples, have been going on success. That's what normally will be called. But actually, if we come back here, and it gets a little more complicated with our commas, but inside of dot then, we have the function, we close the function. Before we close dot then, we'll give it a second argument, which is also a function. And this is the function that will happen if there's an error. what you can actually do here is for that function, you can make sure you know what the error is with that argument there into the function. And you might handle that function somehow. So maybe I'll say it didn't work, and I'll say what the name of the error was. Error was thrown, something like that. Now we'll close the bracket for our error function. We will close the parentheses for our dot then, and we'll do our semicolon. We'll save it. We'll refresh, hit solution. It all works as it happened before, but let's go back to our JavaScript and make sure that an error is actually thrown. So we'll come up here to maybe, for example, right after we grab the sheet in our sheet switching here, or after we switch sheets, and we will throw a new error. Maybe say, oops. Normally this error will be thrown. In some other functionality, you won't just throw it arbitrarily. But you'll see if an error is thrown, we hit save, refresh, and hit solution, we get that alert. It didn't work. Error, oops, was thrown. And notice that the filtering never happens. So basically what's happening here is because an error was thrown, the filtering never happens, but we do go to our error function, that second argument there on the dot then. We'll just make sure this works. Let's go ahead and comment that out, and we'll continue. Now there's a couple other useful functions for asynchronous programming, especially for chaining together dot thens. There's one called dot otherwise, and dot otherwise actually works just like our error function that we created. But what it does is it only calls, it's not two arguments, it only calls if there's an error. So instead of dot then, our success function, comma, our error function, we'll do dot then success dot otherwise. And we'll put our error function inside of there. So that's another way to handle errors inside of your chaining your dot thens together. And the last thing you might want to explore using is dot always. So you can use all of these in combination with each other. Dot always will always happen. So no matter if there's a success or if there's an error, it'll happen no matter what. So that's very useful. And it all depends on your exact use case. Now, if you're going to be chaining together dot thens a lot and going to be doing a lot of complicated asynchronous programming, then I really recommend you go read the documentation on this. And it has a really good explanation on what is asynchronous programming, how can you best use it. Hopefully that this tutorial gave you a bit of a foundation for asynchronous programming and explained to you why it's important. But if you're going to be using it extensively, I recommend taking that extra step and making sure that you've read the documentation on that. That concludes the video on asynchronous programming. I hope you've been able to follow along. I know it's a little bit more complicated than some of our other videos thus far. The next video is a similar subject, and that's on event listeners. So I hope to see you there.